Good evening, friends, and welcome once again. Welcome to this second evening in 2011 Bechtel Lectures, a series now in its 11th year and with a strong tradition of 2 evenings of lectures. People sometimes ask whether they need to come to them both. Of course, the answer is always yes. And last evening, our lecturer gave us enough reason to want to come back. Not only by not answering all of the questions, but by providing the kind of content that so engaged us that we wanted to be back. This theme, we are all treaty people, came alive for us, at least it did for me last evening, as I listened to the stories that Dr. Epp told and reflected on my own personal family history that encompasses 3 continents, and thought about my living in the Niagara Peninsula for my growing up years and part of my working life, and now here in Waterloo region. I'm also a historian and have sometimes assumed, understood, and even proposed that history has answers for us. It clarifies things. It helps us sort things out. And those things are always easier to do in retrospect, of course. Last evening, Dr. Epp reminded us of, and I quote, the history in which we are entangled. Entangled in the best sense of that word. Tangled and connected. We were reminded that there are treaty rights that we exercise every day by living where we do. All of us, we are treaty people. We'd rather forget that. We'd rather not own that past. And we have other ways of explaining it, rationalizing it, resolving it. And yet, the mirror was held up to us. And I was reminded of the words of what was years ago, and I date myself here. Some of you will recall the comic strip Pogo. And the immortal phrase, that probably wasn't original there, but that stuck with me from there. We have met, and I'll paraphrase, I think it was we have met the enemy. What I learned yesterday is we have met the problem, and it is us. That's the settler problem, as opposed to or in conjunction with, entangled with the Indian problem. Well, that was part of what I heard and learned last evening, the stories that we heard. Deeply personal family stories that we could, by connection, engage and enter into. This evening, those stories come under the theme of uncommon ground. I just seen this title a few minutes ago, and so unfortunately my mind hasn't been, although people who know me would say fortunately, perhaps my mind hasn't had opportunity to spin this out. Uncommon ground. We have a little coffee bar here that we call Common Ground. Waiting for some of you to catch on. Thank you. I have to do the same at home. uncommon ground, and I'm intrigued to see how this will be, and hear how this will be spun out by Dr. Epp in this series of 2 lectures under this theme that we are all treaty people. Dr. Roger Epp, I'll reiterate some of my introduction from the last evening, but not all of it. Is founding dean of the University of Alberta's Augustana campus in Camrose, where he is also professor of political studies. He's a native of Saskatchewan, having been born in the town of Hanley, and continues to probe the meaning of that place and that rootedness in the rural West. Dr. Epp has called that rural West his beloved country. And I'll quote again the words that I cited last evening from his own writing. This is the world in which I grew up and now teach. It is at once a familiar landscape, a history, an economy, a culture, a set of communities encountered at close range and sometimes through enduring friendships. This is the beloved country to which I feel a sense of obligation and critical affection, and with whose people I have learned to think with, not just for, about what it means to live well here. Well, once again, Roger, we look forward to your leading us into this consideration. The title of this series, you may be noting it again, but I'll note by way of introduction, is from the title of a book by that name, We Are All Treaty People. Copies of that book are available on the table at the back for $25 on a help yourself and be honest about it basis. And I'm sure Dr. Epp would be happy to sign your copy if you were interested. So take a look back there following the lecture. So once again, Roger, welcome. It's been a pleasure having you here and becoming acquainted. It feels like we are kindred spirits in many respects, not only institutionally, because you are also at a small college affiliated with a large institution, but in many other ways as well. And so it's a pleasure having you and getting to know you. We look forward to your lecture this evening, please.
Thank you. So I think I need that technology. So while I strap myself, or strap the technology on, let me say to those of you who were here last night, you didn't hear the introduction part this evening that referred to the Golden Key Society, and just as well. The rest of you will have to ask, well, how it is that I am yoked with Desmond Tutu, Dolly Parton, and who else was on that list that you found? Bill Cosby, thank you. Thank you again, and thank you for being here. I've had a really good 2 days of hospitality and conversation well, a chance to meet with and talk with lots of people. And I hope that I will say a few things tonight that will mean that you will want to stick around and talk some more. So let me begin. Last night, I began by recalling that in the long cold of January, I participated in 2 sacred and solemn events. Gatherings. One was the burial of an uncle of mine at the country cemetery in Eigenheim in Saskatchewan, and I know some of you in the room felt very much at home with that photograph that I showed. That was great. The other gathering was a first ever round dance, a centennial event for us on our small university campus in a small city on Treaty 6 land in Alberta. Now, I should say I'm slightly self-conscious about the traditional ribbon shirt I'm wearing. This is a shirt I received that night, and I'm usually, well, I never know what to make of people who put on clothes they don't usually wear to make it look like, I don't know, you know what I mean. This is the first time I've worn it, and I thought it was given to me as a gift. And in this case, I would honor the gift by wearing it to tell a story. So, and besides, I get to show it off. I really wanted this ribbon shirt, actually. I don't covet much, but I really coveted this ribbon shirt. I'll confess that in this chapel. So let me tell you about the round dance. For me, it started sometime last fall when I traveled to Wetaskiwin, I guess, in Cree, about 25 miles east or west of where I live, to present tobacco to an elder, a former student of mine, it so happened, which was what made it extra special for me, to ask whether he would oversee the round dance ceremonies and the protocols. And I'd never approached an elder in that way, so this was the start of some learning for me. He agreed. And in the ensuing weeks, a stickman, actually two of them, were selected to orchestrate the dancing. Word went out to singers and drummers across the prairies that this is the place you're going to want to be on Saturday night, January 29th. Our cafeteria agreed to prepare a feast of bison stew and biscuits and blueberries, a blueberry dessert. We can do this because we have an amazing cafeteria that still knows how to make things from basic ingredients. And they had to do this for an indeterminate number of guests. Donations were collected for the giveaway dance, one of those recklessly generous redistributive social practices that the bureaucrats and the missionaries found so hard to accept at an earlier time in history. The eagle feathers were ordered for a ceremony I'll describe in a minute. And late on the Saturday afternoon of the dance, as we had negotiated, the fire suppression systems in our sophisticated new building were turned off. Nothing is simple. The smudge fire was lit in the gymnasium, and the elder took charge. He said a blessing, he took the pipe, and he passed it around a circle that included university leaders, our MLA, our mayor, some staff and students, some of them Aboriginal, some of them not, plus several residents from the Federal Corrections Center or the Healing Center on the reserve where the elder led the cultural programming. Actually, I was saying at dinner that I was sitting in the pipe ceremony waiting for it to begin, and said to the fellow next to me, asked him where he was from. And he said, well, he was from Hobbema now, which is where the four First Nations come together. And I said, so where are you from originally? He said, well, he's from Winnipeg. And I said, well, what brought you to Hobbema? He said, the Corrections Service of Canada. By the elder's preference, and you may want to note this because it jarred a few people, only men were allowed in the circle. They were women who had worn long skirts because this was part of the protocol. Some elders permit women, some don't. When the pipe had gone around the circle, it was time for the feast, and hundreds lined up. Inside the building, the smell of sweetgrass had started to permeate. I think it would take a couple of days to not permeate. It was great. Outside, volunteers watched the fire that was built partly to warm the skins of the drum for the evening. And the people came. They came from up the street. They came from other campuses of the university. They came from communities in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Actually, they were texting people at 5 in the afternoon saying, "You really got to be here. Get in your car in North Battleford, Saskatchewan and drive out here, please." The singer Susan Glukark, who has become an important mentor to some of our students, was there. And she was pleased not to be the only Inuit in the room, because one of our former students had returned wearing a sealskin vest and skirt and boots. This was the chance to show who she was. Now, because this is a centennial year for us, we had made a special invitation to our Aboriginal alumni to return for this round dance. This was not a list we'd ever kept before. It was surprisingly long. Many of them had been my students over the years. The list reached back to the 1950s, which is not as long as I've been there. But at one point in the evening, the dancing stopped. Several elders came on stage, and it was my privilege to call forward by name those who had earned degrees in the 25 or so years before it became practice as part of the University of Alberta to award an eagle feather, to have an elder present an eagle feather to every Aboriginal graduate at convocation. The feather honors, I would say, the achievement of a degree, but also the hard work of living in two cultures to do it. And the powerful emotions on the faces and bodies of those who walked across the stage to receive their feathers that night told the truth of that hard work. I will not forget that evening. And then the recipients formed a semicircle on the floor. The elders said a blessing. An honor song was sung, and the dancing resumed. I should make sure that some of you can see this. By our best estimates, about 1,000 people were there that night. Young and old, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. People said it was the best blend they'd ever seen. There were 60 singers and drummers, including the Grammy-nominated, 6-time Grammy-nominated Northern Cree singers. 60 is apparently a very impressive number, because there was another round dance at Saddle Lake, and apparently they wouldn't have had nearly 60 drummers because they all came our way. At midnight, everything stopped for bologna sandwiches, which is the custom. I hadn't had bologna since I was a kid. And at 2 a.m., the gym emptied. The singers lined up for their payment. And a very efficient cleanup crew had the place cleaned up in, I don't know, half an hour. And for that long night, 5 p.m. to 2 a.m., our campus had become what the literary scholar Daniel Coleman down the road at McMaster, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention that, we had become what Daniel Coleman calls uncommon ground. Not common ground, not middle ground, uncommon ground. Maybe uncomfortable, risky, transformative ground. Now, for Daniel Coleman, uncommon ground is the space, and maybe the metaphorical space, on which we are unsettled, on which the familiar is disrupted, spaces on which we need to pay attention, spaces on which we can't simply swallow up or import the signs of the other, this is his language, into our existing frameworks in order to find value in them. Uncommon ground. In the first lecture, as was said, I examined what I have called the settler problem. The mentality, the moral indifference, the historical ignorance, rooted in the mythology that there was no one here when our people came, that our hard work entitles us to what we have, we made something of it, that the slate was wiped clean for us in this new land, quote unquote, and that the previous inhabitants had been safely quarantined so that we could live side by side but without much significant human contact. Now, if that mythology was always a little bit at odds, say, with the small acts of mostly forgotten cooperation between first generations of settlers and Aboriginal neighbors, where real communities lived side by side, it is still at work as mythology, even in the resentment, in the guilt that attend the reality that Aboriginal peoples are still here, with new cultural confidence, easy to notice, with real historic claims to press, in case we'd forgotten. And so the well-meaning questions are asked. Why can't we just put the past behind us? Why can't we just all be Canadians? That's the dangerous tendency in all of even the important talk from the Prime Minister on down about reconciliation. That even honest admissions are about the desire for closure, not for a new relationship. The desire for closure. So it's important for me to say, maybe at this point, that I have not come here to stand on a prophetic soapbox, or as I said last night, to defecate in the nest of my ancestors. I will not speak in the language of theology because I'm not trained in it. I will not speak in the language of social justice, with all of its impatience to put the world right, without asking, whose justice? Rather, I want to encourage, this is a word I've learned from Daniel Coleman lately, I want to encourage those of you who live alongside the Grand River to be seized by the practical hermeneutical imperatives of doing so. So what do I mean by this? Well, I thought I should use the word hermeneutic somewhere just to establish my credentials. So let me say, first of all, that as a non-theologian, it's important to liberate the notion of hermeneutics from its usual place in theology or philosophy in relation to written text and the interpretation of text. I've always been interested in practical hermeneutics. And so for me, a practical hermeneutic imperative, the need to understand, the need to make sense of something, arises from the following conditions. And if I was really adept at PowerPoint, I would have them all just slide down one after the other, but you'll have to imagine the PowerPoint slides that go with this. Following conditions. Number one, the recognition of real and enduring difference. Number two, the unavoidability of face-to-face encounter with those who represent that difference. And number three, the need to understand those people, not defeat them, not dismiss them, in order to coexist, in order to live well in a particular place. Those are my three conditions. Recognition of real and enduring difference, the unavoidability of direct, honest, face-to-face contact with people who are not like you, and the need to understand them, not defeat them, not dismiss them, in order to coexist and live well in that place. So in other words, this practical hermeneutical imperative is rooted in place. Like the work of apology and reconciliation, there is only so much that national political leadership can do. It is on a more local scale, often where the tensions and the risks are much higher, that the work of imagining an uncommon space is also most real, most urgent, and most meaningfully undertaken, where it's not an abstraction. It's at the local level, too, that platitudes and romanticized images collapse very quickly. They don't stand up to day-to-day scrutiny over a period of time. So this hermeneutic imperative starts with direct human encounters, not with policy, not with justice, not with high drama. That is my ordering. It starts with relationships. To step beyond the settler problem is first to be a neighbor, not an advocate. It is first to build relationships, not, and this is my answer, my 24-hour marinated answer to the question I was asked yesterday, not to find a solution. We can come back to this later. You don't enter into relationships to fix a problem or find a solution. You do so because you share living space, because you might learn things, and because you might even enjoy people's company. First thing to do, this first step out of the settler problem, is to build human relationships. Put another way, it is better to know Aboriginal people than to know about them, which was a phrase I stole from a lovely, lovely essay sent to me by a student at another university who'd read something I'd written and sent me a story he'd written about growing up in Wetaskiwin. And sneaking off on the bus with his new friend Sonny Cardinal after school every day, telling his mother he was doing something else, and hanging out at Sonny's place and breakdancing, which he was very, very bad at, but figuring out. Better to know them than to know about them. Where relationships exist, the courage to stand alongside people will come when it is needed. That's my ordering. Let me give another prairie example to illustrate what I mean. Some of you, if you knew about Eigenheim, you will also know where Laird, Saskatchewan is. And some of you may actually have more history with this than I do. Stony Hill, or Stony Knoll, is the high point in a triangular tract of land, about 30 square miles, that is situated alongside the North Saskatchewan River, north and west of the village of Laird, about 8 miles from Eigenheim, I think. It was land chosen in 1876 at Fort Carleton by one of the signatories, a headman named Young Chippewayan, and his Small Plains Cree Band. It was to be reserve number 107. Though in their adjustment to the post-Buffalo economy, they did not take up permanent or continuous residence on that 30 square mile piece of land. And in 1897, the federal government arbitrarily took back that land under some pressure to find room for settlers, including Mennonite settlers. Made it available to homesteaders, Mennonite, Lutheran. The Lutherans built their church on that hill. Even Europeans could recognize the spiritual importance of a hill. And the band was dispersed to other reserves. They lived as squatters. They had no status, well, as members. Their dispossession was the source of persistent grievance, and by the mid to late 70s, I think there were episodes where young members of that band would drive onto the farms of people who lived in the area and say, "This is mine, I'm going to get it back." I remember a little bit of this. I was a student at Rostron Junior College at the time and knew people from the neighborhood who worried about what this meant. We thought this was ours. We thought the place had been, well, made new for us. There was no one here when we came. We made something of it. I don't know lots of the details of the next 30 years, and it's not really my story to tell as an insider. But the public record says that on August 22nd, 2006, 130 years to the day after the signing of Treaty 6 at Fort Carlton, settler and Cree descendants gathered on that hill for a day that included a pipe ceremony, a feast, farmer sausage and buffalo stew or bison stew, and quite a mix, and the signing of a declaration of harmony and justice. We are all treaty people, they said, and they committed together to work so that the young Chippewyans' claim for land, a land base, could be resolved, and so that, they said, future generations of all of them could live in peace, justice, and sufficiency for all. The initiative that day, or leading up to that day, had been taken by Cree people who wanted to commemorate the treaty on that anniversary on that hill. They involved Leonard Dole from Mennonite Central Committee, who had had a very long history of association with them. They needed a go-between. And by all accounts, the Cree people led in the organization of that event. They erected a teepee. They also erected a square tent, the Aboriginal circle, the European square. They put them both up. The church is no longer there. They put them both up. They eased the nervousness with some gentle humor. They created uncommon ground, as did those who prepared the food, sewed the quilt for that day, told stories, exchanged gifts, and gave thanks to the Creator. In the eloquent words of one of the participants, we settlers, you see it here, are unsettled on our own land. We don't know the language. We don't know the liturgy. But we recognize the love, the respect for land. The prayers, the drums, the singing carry us into the day. Two communities step over risk and embrace stories, losses, strength, and dreams. And she adds, hope is in the hearts and hands of those who chose to set their chairs on that hill that day. Another participant, Barb Froze, who was a Mennonite pastor and also with her husband, a farmer at the base of the hill, presented the MCC quilt to the young Chippewayan chief and his wife, and she said at the time, "This quilt symbolizes the day that we shared. Many hands gathered pieces to make this blanket. In the same way, many hands prepared and gathered the pieces for this day, and on this day we sewed all those pieces together." Now you should know that the event in 2006 was not a one-shot deal. There continues to be a relationship. There continue to be things like fundraisers, coffee houses in the city of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, ways of connecting people and also raising dollars to pursue the research behind the land claim. Who would have thought fear could be transformed, really in not so many years, into something else, into a powerful relationship? Last night I mentioned the author Paulette Regan and her book, Unsettling the Settler Within, based on her work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, looking into or documenting, archiving the residential school abuses. She describes in that book, maybe it's the high point of the book, an equally powerful ceremony, a community feast, a potlatch, one of those, again, extravagant redistributive mechanisms. This one in Hazelton, British Columbia, in the north, Gitxsan First Nation territory. That was the occasion for a formal apology from leaders of the United Church of Canada, whose school it was that the local students had gone to. And it was also a chance for survivors to come home, to be formally readmitted, or brought back, reinstated into the community. It was another small, powerful step in the feast hall, the place of public memory. She writes, "The Hazelton Feast Hall in Gitxsan territory is a long way from the urban office towers where we can safely feel distanced from the victims of our benevolent peacemaking. Shifting from denial to recognition requires engaging history authentically. The challenge for settlers," she adds, "is to listen attentively, reflectively, and with humility when we are invited into these spaces." The hermeneutical work, the imperative, the imagination I want to draw and recollect from these stories demands several attributes or points of openness, not sure what you call them, awarenesses, and I have a list of 7 this time, so again, imagine your PowerPoint slide with these dropping down cleverly. The first one is an awareness of place. Maybe I'd call it the gift to be in the way and accept it, not avoid it. The gift to be in the way. Secondly, the willingness to accept an invitation when it is offered. Thirdly, an openness to reciprocity, not as something we grant, but that we accept. Fourth is a sense of risk, unsettlement, not knowing. Everyone is afraid that day before the ceremony at Stony Hill. No one knew what the day would be like. People on my campus were afraid the day of the round dance. They didn't know what. They're going to trash. No one said that. They knew what 1 or 2 of them was thinking. Going to trash the place? It's all a risk. Fifth, the importance of listening, not talking, listening. Sixth would be a respect for cultural protocols and sacred spaces. And seventh, maybe it's a bigger mouthful to chew off, a refusal to accept that the past is past, that the world is fixed on a certain trajectory, or especially that Aboriginal peoples are so absolutely and essentially and unalterably incommensurate in their view of the world, that there is no real hope of us understanding each other. It is important that we do get it, some of it, and dangerous to assume that we never will. Inside what I call the hermeneutical imperative is the freedom to face up to our own history, to hear it told differently, to tell entangled stories of how we came to be here that confound the mythology that there was no one here when we came. There is maybe also the freedom to locate ourselves in a different national and regional story as well. So what if, for example, we chose to understand Canada as having been founded, these are the words of James Tully, on an act of sharing that is almost incomprehensible in its generosity? That's a different way of understanding Canada. Founded on an act of sharing almost incomprehensible in its generosity. Or what if you made the two-row wampum with the help of First Nations teachers, the foundational text for this region? And imagine that it could somehow reorient how you live here, as neighbors, in a region, in a watershed. It matters what stories we choose to tell. There is one more story that I want to mention, though it is a meeting of two people and not two communities. And it happens in such uncommon spaces as a sweat lodge and a prison. I've been thinking about it in relation to this talk, and so I thought I'd better throw it in relation to the Hermeneutic Imperative especially. In the opening pages of the book, Stolen Life, the reader is told how it is that a Cree woman named Yvonne Johnson, convicted of first-degree murder in that community I've mentioned a couple of times with Tascoin, will come to write her life story with Rudy Weeb, a Mennonite man, a settler, whose novel about her great-great-grandfather Big Bear she had read with great reluctance. The novel had slapped her in the face with how much he could understand. She wanted to know, how is it that you came to know as much as you do? What was the force behind you? Who are you? And she writes feverishly as he asks. She trusts him with her notes, her audio tapes, all her legal transcripts with all of the annotations she's scribbled in the margins. She had taken the initiative to contact him. She was curious. There were things she needed to know, and he chose to respond. He did not get out of the way. He did not shirk the responsibility in this case of the words he had sent into the world. Our past, she writes to him from prison, has given each of us a gift of understanding. Those are the drums from the round dance, some of them. I want to be very careful not to say that Mennonites have a self-appointed special role when it comes to the work of understanding reconciliation and sharing. That's too much to load onto anyone, humble as we might be. The story of Stony Knoll is not the norm. And it's safe to say the work of MCC Ontario in places like Ipperwash and Caledonia is not universally appreciated in member churches. But there is work to do in the places in Canada where Mennonites live, urban and rural. We have been given the gift of proximity, of being in the way, and we can choose to accept it. There is work to be done in schools like this one, and in churches, not just the usual kind of progressive ones, but the conservative ones too. For we do have resources, stories, that can serve as bridges to understanding. Those of us who are attentive to our own stories of sorrow and displacement and loss, Those of us whose ancestors were once outsiders in this country, linguistically, culturally, politically, sometimes called pariahs, parasites. Those of us whose ancestors were indeed once attracted to this country because it promised room for many kinds of people to coexist. That's how my great-grandfather decided it would be a good thing to come to Canada, because if they could have French-speaking people in Quebec, they must have room for Mennonites who spoke German. Those of us who are still rooted in real places with complex and layered histories. Those of us who can treat understanding as a gift when it is hardest to achieve. Those of us who are capable of giving and receiving hospitality, of preparing a feast. Those of us who live with reverence and humility. And this is a bigger group, I suspect, by now, we're aggregating, than the usual small choir of the converted. We, all of us, have work to do and resources with which to do it. Or better to say, the work will find us when we allow ourselves to be in the way. The uncommon ground with Aboriginal neighbors will surprise us. And we will be encouraged to let go, to imagine and participate in something new without the certainty that we know the outcome. Now, as my Cree friends would say, "Aye, hi, that's it. That's enough. Thank you."
But it's only the beginning. He invited us to also be in conversation with you about what we've heard and how we've reflected on that. So I welcome your comments, your questions, your observations. Begin over here.
I was wondering, I noticed that your choice of words, and unfortunately I wasn't able to attend last night, so perhaps I missed this, but seemed to be to describe us as settlers.
Mm-hmm.
As a settler society, as opposed to as a colonial society. And I'm wondering if there was a deliberate choice there, or what you think the implications of where you might be.
I did speak a little bit about language and the difficulties of language last night, but I didn't speak about that one. I see that Emma LaRocque recently in a book has challenged the notion that we're settlers at all, because we didn't really settle very much. Moved on from one thing to the next. We are newcomers still. I don't know that I have everything invested in that term, so I could easily be talked out of it. Yeah, I'm not sure. For a long time, I suppose, there were countries officially designated in the British Colonial Office as white settler societies, which was an interesting designation, as opposed to the colonizers who did things in territories without settlers. So I don't know. I don't have a lot invested, but maybe maybe it's borrowing the language and seeing what it does. Not opposed to your language.
Just curious.
Yeah.
So I noticed that you changed the title of tonight's talk from stories we tell ourselves to uncommon ground.
Right.
Thinking, is that because it's been happening stories?
No, I told you last night I'm lousy at titles, so I could have used the same one, still about the stories we choose to tell.
I mean, I reminded of. I mean, you said that we should go and get to know, build relationships how, I mean, because even now, I mean, you know, when you have like these, I guess you could say, like when the Aboriginals, they were placed, I mean, they're in these, I guess, since like 100 years ago, these,
Reserves?
yeah, I guess you could say reserves. I mean, and how can we go there, or how can they get out of it? I mean,
They're living in every city. Some of them are on this campus. You pay attention. You probably know people without knowing they're Aboriginal. Oh, sorry.
I was thinking of what you were saying of how do we look on reserve and it's why do we look for they as opposed to us? Living in community is accepting all, not labeling people as being different. As human beings, we are all, you know, we're all part of what goes on. And as soon as we start making distinctions between you are this and I am that, that you make yourself a part instead of a part of.
So the point is that
As you said, to know a person,
not to know a label.
Yeah.
I'd say it's still important to respect difference,
Yeah.
not assume we can't get it. That lets us off the hook too easily. Well, maybe there's not more to say about that, unless you'd like me to say more.
Well, no, I think it's that I came to the scriptures not as a Mennonite, not knowing it was a Mennonite city. And to me, it's very interesting it was extremely interesting to hear people speaking as part of the Mennonite community and to how it fit their lives and what they've seen. And that you know, I come from whatever perspective I was brought in, that it always seems to me that the biggest troubles come when I agree that honoring tradition, honoring who people are is important, but not labeling as different. If that makes any sense.
As long as we're not the ones rushing to make people the same.
Well, I don't think assimilation is the answer, but that saying we can all be, I mean, as with the Stony Hill, you know, it's a coming together. It's not a separation. Whereas the reserve system is a separation. I mean, that was the reserve system in Canada is what the apartheid system was based on. That they looked at the Canadian reserves and basically said, "But why do you let them leave?"
And that's true, the point being that the reserve system is part of the problem. It's part of the separation and the quarantining, except that in a way it answered the request then and still for a land base. So somehow those things still need to be wrestled with. Place in the world that is home.
Yes.
You mentioned the stories that you choose to tell. I was wondering, one story which you had promised in the first lecture was to explain or to talk about the pallbearers at your father's funeral.
Did I promise that?
You mentioned it and you said,
Oh.
explain. And you could choose not to, but if you would.
Sure. The speaker is claiming an obligation, and you're not the first person who said that, that I made last night to tie up the loose ends of a story involving the funeral. Here, I'll show you the picture just to give you a photographic, well, something to look at. So I told the story of being at an uncle's funeral at Eigenheim Cemetery, where we have lowered our family into the ground for more than 100 years. And came around at the end to say how unremarked it was, maybe as a teaser, that that 3 of the grandsons who carried my uncle's coffin from the hearse to the grave at -30 were Aboriginal. And in all of those cases, those 3 would be they would be family adoptions. At that point in Western history or Saskatchewan history, where that happened more than it does now. So that's the end of that story, or the last piece of it. Sorry.
Not the end yet. Right here.
I too have been enthralled by all your stories, and I guess I might have blacked out because I thought you had said that you were going to tell us about one that occurred in prison and the other one in the sweat lodge, and I don't know what happened to the sweat lodge story.
Same story. These are the places where Rudy Weeb met
Okay,
Yvonne Johnson.
thank you. I thought it was just an encore one.
No, sorry. So the question was, what happened to the prison and the sweat lodge? Yeah.
This audience is very attentive.
They are very attentive. I've noticed I can't slip anything past them at all.
Yeah, ask our faculty. It's a tough job. Derek.
I was curious to hear a bit more about, you mentioned the graduation ceremony with handing out the eagle feathers, and I'm wondering if you could reflect back on the years that you've been there. What have been kind of highlights or good possibilities or things that you feel like the college or the university has done well, and what are some things that perhaps haven't been done well with respect to this issue, or those people coming? It's just a striking image, these people coming back, and what's kind of going through their minds in navigating these two cultures as you.
The most interesting alum I've met is someone who attended back in the 50s when it was still, I think entirely still when he was there, a Lutheran high school about to start morphing into a university. He is a retired teacher now. If you saw him, you would say visually, in the way that these things get categorized, he sure looks Aboriginal. And I got to know him at an alumni event, and I went down to see him once, or I was passing through his city, and he told me his story, which he had not told very often, about being a child of English and I think maybe, well, English and Cree Métis, and it was as if all the Cree genetic material had loaded up in him, and his siblings were blonde-haired, and they could attend this Scandinavian Lutheran school without notice, and he stuck out like a sore thumb in the 1950s. And in some ways it seemed as if he had not even, in the way it was, understood or been all that curious about his own identity for a long time. And I told him the story of a man named Vernon Wishart, who was a retired United Church minister in Alberta, whose family had kept it a secret that they were in fact Métis. On his father's side, both sides, the male line, they were Orkney, Hudson's Bay Company fur trading folks, and on the women's side, they were Cree. And this was the family secret that no one talked about until it was sort of vaguely known But he traces his story back through all of these ancestors as far as he can, and this is a revelation. So I mentioned this to Walter, the other fellow I was talking about, and kind of nodded and said that was him. So I can't imagine what it would have been like for him, and admired the fact that he has been coming to alumni gatherings. So that's one. Some of the connections were made in the early 90s when we started teaching courses by some contractual arrangement that probably was lucrative, too lucrative at the start, and that killed it, but at tribal college. And I did a little bit of that teaching. It was then housed in an old residential school. I'm sure in that first group of adult students I had maybe a dozen or so. There were some tough characters. One of them came over and finished a degree, not quickly, who told me along the way incredible stories of brutality that he'd experienced because he dared ask some questions about band administration. Actually, because I'm a political philosopher, I was reading Machiavelli at this tribal college with these students who told me stories that far exceeded anything they found in the Prince, which is interesting, which is useful. And we saw him through to graduation. We saw the elder who presented the eagle feathers through to graduation. And I supervised a project with him where he was, after this same period of warrior society occupying the band office. My student Dennis, my former student, is calling me from inside the occupation saying, "What do we do now?" My other former student, the guy you saw in the picture holding his eagle feather, is a newly elected reformist band counselor who's on the other side. And I'm feeling like I know too many people on too many sides of a complicated mess. And this third student, the former the elder, who was an elder in the making, and everyone said it about him at the time, had tried to resuscitate an old cultural concept, that of the stick man or the whip man, almost as an ombudsperson, someone who could crack the whip when it needed to be cracked outside the structures of band government. And I was with him in the hall when he presented this idea to the elders, and they kind of were curious about me. I actually describe it a little bit in someplace in the book. Big screen TV at one end, volume turned up way too loud, and who are the daytime TV folks? Kathy Lee and that Regis guy. Culturally completely disorienting, but then they got down to business. And all of a sudden, maybe I don't know, maybe I'd taken a pen out to write a note, and they slipped into Cree, and they were off. And they eventually said to him, "No, you cannot use that cultural concept in that way. We won't let you." So for me, watching some of these people cross the stage was to remember all of those stories and all of that learning, which is as much my learning as theirs. I didn't know all of the students, but I knew lots of them. But I would say it's only very recently that we have begun to think about engaging that community, not just the individuals who kind of wander out of it as refugees looking for something, but to engage the community. And so we made a point of honoring one of the women elders who's been very instrumental in education, 3 of whose children have been students of ours. We gave her the award we give out every year to the member of the community that whose contribution to our campus is significant. And usually it goes to people who fit a certain kind of stereotype or fall within a certain range. And it was a real pleasure to call Teresa Wildcat forward and present that in the company of all kinds of other upstanding citizens of Camrose, Alberta, and normalize it. So I would say that's something we're still learning to do, build community-to-community relations.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think almost half of the population of Saskatchewan is native or some native connection.
No, not yet. That would be a high number.
Okay.
I think some trajectories say we could be somewhere near there by about 2050. So sometimes the talk show folks want to get us there too early for the wrong reasons. But
the point I want to make is that I cannot recall any native member of the provincial legislature. And maybe you probably know more about the Alberta situation. People just aren't represented in the government. Is that, do you have a comment on that?
So the question is how to explain the fact that even though Aboriginal people would constitute a reasonably large share of the population in some provinces, they are dramatically underrepresented in legislatures. It's not the case that there are no Aboriginal elected members. There are not many. Some of that is the ambivalence of those communities themselves about seeking that kind of office, about provincially, about seeking or even recognizing the validity of provincial governments. They want their relationship to be with the Crown in the form of the national government. So that's sometimes an obstacle. Rates of voter turnout are not very high on reserves, sometimes because there aren't many ballot boxes there. But I think there's an ambivalence on that side too. But from time to time there have been national politicians. We had one next door to us, Willie Littlechild, a Cree. He was a member of Parliament, but for only one term, I think. And I imagine that it was difficult for him to represent people across what is sometimes a pretty raw divide. And maybe there were people in town who didn't feel represented by this Cree politician as well. I can't speak to that with direct knowledge, but maybe that's how I'd answer the question. I don't know whether we will see more of that in the near future.
What are some of the characteristics of the settler community that made the Stony Hill possible?
You might know that answer more than I. That's your home territory. The question is, what made the people of that community at Stony Knoll do what they did? I'm guessing that there was leadership that helped. Sometimes community leadership can give permission to say certain thoughts are within the realm of thinkable thoughts, can push that way. But even those leaders were really apprehensive in the days leading up to that. I don't know, I might say that the people of Tiefengrunt have always been slightly on the politically radical side, but for Mennonites. But still, people felt very threatened for many years when that came up. So I'm not sure. I think the quality of leadership would have helped. And past that, I don't know. Because it is remarkable. You may have more insight.
Well, I wondered if it had something to do with how the community respects the land.
I think that's part of it.
You know, that suddenly, like I know when I was thinking about this about a year ago, using the words, we are all beneficiaries, and sort of feeling that perhaps there's something about the fact that we don't really own the land. In which case there's a coming together of
Aboriginal and Mennonite theology, actually.
It would be interesting. That's a point on which you do get lots of resistance from Aboriginal people. How can you understand how we think about land? So I'm not going to presume to know that. My hunch is that if settler people are think hard enough about it, they have some ways of getting there, and sometimes they're theological. My greatest classroom experiment, well, one of them was a complete flop, but the one that succeeded by sheer, I don't know, it was a miracle in its own way. I was teaching a course in politics of Aboriginal peoples, and we had Aboriginal students and mostly non-Aboriginal students, maybe 1/3, 2/3. And there were two people in the back who always were kind of at each other. One was a Treaty 7 Blackfoot from down south, and the other was a Ukrainian 3rd or 4th generation young woman from eastern Alberta. And one day we were talking about land and land claims, and I turned to her and said, "Tell me about your family's land, and tell me what, describe it to me. Tell me what it means." And she starts talking about land and identity in ways that cause Barney, the guy beside her, it's one of those rare times where in the comic book way you see a jaw drop. That was interesting. That she could describe a connection to land in ways that he could respect. And then they could talk. And then they were inseparable after that. They understood something in common. And then she could get what he had been unsuccessful at saying. So I think there is something there, but I don't want to say that I know what it is, or we could bottle it up and tell people this is how it is. Something about landedness that is more than, as you say, more than about owning an exclusive domain and that kind of language.
Yeah, the stewardship aspect, I think might play into that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question back there.
It's interesting that you mentioned identity, because when I saw the title of your lecture, I recalled something about John Ralston Saul talked about the Aboriginal identity of Canada.
Métis Nation.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you had any comments about Saul and your own thinking.
I haven't read the whole book, I have to admit. So I better not say a lot. I'm familiar with the general idea. I think maybe it is another one of those alternate stories. The question that I should repeat, the question is whether I have, how what I'm saying might connect to what John Ralston Saul has written in a book. What's the title? This Fair Country. Thank you. I think what he is offering is another way to see the national story. So I guess I have to be honest and say, because I haven't read it, I find it an interesting proposition, but I can't say much more than that.
Is that what you're offering? Like another way to tell the national story? Are you guys both?
He's up at this level, and I'm trying to be at this level.
Now, what do you mean by that?
That I want to get there by paying far more attention to small things and local things, and he's writing a grander narrative than I'm writing.
Here, question.
Some people probably here arrived from the former Soviet Union for obvious reasons. And I'm wondering, with your involvement, how do you see Canada's situation compared to other countries in the world in the relationship between Aboriginal and settler?
So the question is, comparatively, how is Canada's, how is that relationship?
How are we faring compared to other countries in the world in that Aboriginal settler equation that you've been discussing?
That's a hard one. I think every country is different. In some ways, Canada was built on a secondary mythology, which is the mythology that we were much kinder, gentler, more legalistic than the Americans, who sent in the 7th Cavalry to do their work. And that's true, but historically, it was for a much longer time in the United States that tribal identities and multiple jurisdictions, legal and political, survived, when in Canada they'd been rolled up under the Great Paternalistic Indian Act. So it's never a single, there's not an easy way of ranking those things. I think Canada is probably a better place than Australia was for Aborigines for a long time. But these are relative things. I think the settler mythology, as I said last night, is pretty consistent from place to place. There was no one here where we came. We made something of it. That's our entitlement to it. And anything else is an inconvenience that we have a hard time recognizing. That's the same in South Africa, in Israel, in Australia. So it's that mythology that is what I keep thinking needs to be the subject. And relative benevolence is something we have to be careful about.
We have 2 more questions. I think we'll leave it at that for now. This one over here, please.
A few questions back, the issue of land claims came up, and some years ago I had conversation with Mennonites who lived in the Laird Tiefenbrund area of Saskatchewan, and I think land claims were at the forefront at the time, and these were sort of high-energy social justice Mennonites who said they would be prepared to give up their farms should their ownership of those farms be challenged in the courts. Well, of course, we know land claims get mired in a black hole of bureaucracy.
I can imagine that there are places where that might be a really important symbolic thing to do, and by saying something is symbolic, I don't mean it's unimportant or trivial. Symbolism is hugely important. So I don't know who owns the top of that hill in Saskatchewan, but if the church is no longer there, maybe there's a different way to imagine what that space is and for whom it is. Or maybe how it becomes uncommon ground by the visual markers that are there. Maybe there are places where that kind of act is what it takes by way of response to start something new.
Okay, one more question over here.
A few comments ago, you slipped by rather quickly a statement. I think you said Great Paternalistic Indian Act.
Yep.
You went by that kind of quickly, and I'm wondering what in your mind might be a better policy or approach than that Great Paternalistic Indian Act.
That would be in the way that Reach for the Top used to say it, a short snapper. The Indian Act, I mean, it's gone through various permutations in its long history since about 1870 or so. It has variously governed when it was people could leave, could sell agricultural produce, could go to school. It, for and still defines the nature of band governance, sometimes very deliberately undermining traditional forms of governance by fitting it into a model in which councillors are accountable not to their own people but to the bureaucracy. So those are the paternalistic elements. What's interesting, though, is how attempts to change the Indian Act have been resisted by First Nations people themselves, because they worry what that means, whether there is in the loss of the Indian Act, paternalistic as it is, an attempt to take away identity and legal standing and all of those things. So I don't know if people get very worried about just winding up the Indian Act.
Well, I think a lot of people see it as sort of one big national dole. And the issue, because obviously various reserves are better able than others to manage
right.
to have more resources at hand or whatever. So the issue is how you get people off the dole into being self-reliant. Canadians is one way it's expressed sometimes, but you're saying it's also a big systemic thing about identity and place.
It is those things, and it is a form of it structures governance on band councils in ways that some people would not want to abandon, because band governance can be a tremendous prize. It's control of resources in the community. And so what do you do? What comes first? I think in lots of ways people in those communities have to decide how they will be governed and how that governing will be kept in check. But that's always a messy process. Are Canadians patient enough to have people come to their own understanding of what kind of governance is appropriate for them?
All right, given the attentiveness and mindfulness of this audience, I'm grateful to you, first of all, for helping me keep my promise to them last evening, and that is that you would take us on a journey into new places that may sometimes be uncomfortable, unfamiliar, but that would teach us much about ourselves. And you've taken us on that kind of journey indeed. A journey of discovery about our country, about ourselves, about the people with whom we live in this land. You focused on our Aboriginal neighbors. We could expand that circle, I suppose, as well. But for the sake of this topic, certainly we've reflected on relationships and on place and on how we honor the sacredness of those both. Thank you for being gentle with us. Some of us have heard this theme and this topic addressed and have brought with us feelings and emotions and anxieties that run deep because of guilt and anger and fear and exasperation. And you've led us on a journey through and past and into those places that has allowed us to go there and touch them in a way that is inviting, inspiring, challenging, and engaging. I think you've brought us to a place where we can't go back. We can only go forward now with what we've heard, what we've felt, what we've seen, not only on the screen, but in our mind's eye, and the various drop-down screens that have appeared in our minds as you spoke and as you told your stories. Thank you for leading us on that journey, for sharing personally, humbly, but courageously about something that is important for who we are as Canadians. Please join me in thanking you.